Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Flight podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook, and support me on Subscribe Star Locals and Buy Me a Coffee. Now, we have Florian back again for more of our faith and science videos. Glad to have you back, Florian.
Yeah, glad to be here.
So this is Casual Stream 109, is Genesis a History review. So as Genesis History was a 2017 film produced by Creationist to sort of produce a digestible, summarized form, if you will, of the creation science project, covering all the big points, primarily geology and primarily biology, with a little bit on astronomy and some other stuff. But those are the big two. And we already talked about ID. We've done a lot of the ID stuff. And I thought, well, let's go to the next level. And this also dovetails with our video on dinosaur tissue because that comes up as well. So why don't you give us some of your first thoughts on the documentary as a whole, Florian?
Yes, well done. It's cinematically well done. Nice music. It's interesting. Presented in an interesting format. It touches sort of like all the questions we had talked about and all the debate points between creationists and science. So it has like the entire catalog.
Good. So what would you say? It starts off with geology.
Yeah.
And it starts off with certain claims about the formations of the Southwest. So to sum up the geology section, they actually sum it up quite well in the documentary. The idea is that you go from a lot of water in a little bit of time, which is their model, catastrophism, versus a lot of time in a little bit of water, which is the standard model. Now, they don't really get into this a whole lot, but when Charles Lyell was introducing long geological ages, the standard model for everybody was catastrophism. The idea that there was catastrophic events such as floods. Now, there were the Christians who argued that it was the flood of Noah, but there were like other scientists who were like deists who argued that there were multiple deluges, and they had their own theories behind that, for which Noah's flood was just one. But the catastrophism model was dominant prior to Charles Lyell, and it was held by even non-Christians such as deists as a foundation. The other things they get into is that if you look between the sediment of the different layers, and they were in the American Southwest, the Colorado River, so on, you don't see the kinds of erosion between them that you would have expected had they been laid down simply. They also make the claim that, well, over tens of millions of years, wouldn't the canyon have just collapsed in on itself, rather than still remain intact under the pressure of the water? So these are all hydraulic arguments. But so, what do you think of that section, Florian?
The section of the mountainous region.
Well, the section on geology, where they talk about their interpretations of the geological record and why they think that the geological record doesn't support the standard model.
Yeah, they have a very, very interesting point that the radiometric dating method that relies on, or that assumes that radioactive decay rates are intrinsic to atoms in any material, in any radioactive material, can be influenced by isotopes being pushed in there during floods and stuff like that. So that basically, yes, there's intrinsic radioactive decay, but it's not. It may be not. It may be not what we see. May not be continuous. The rock that we see may not be a continuous. May not have a continuous history, right? Which would be one of the it would have to have a continuous history so that we can derive radiometric data from the decay. So I think that was one point that they made, and then they also come to the dinosaur issue, right, that we talked about last time, where you have soft tissue inside a dinosaur, which means that either dinosaurs aren't that old, or yeah, if it's not an artifact.
Right. So before we get too far in here, this was actually from before the show went live. We got a super chat from Middleton Walker for $9.99. Thank you very much, Middleton Walker. In the beginning.
In the beginning, yeah.
Yep. So, if we look at the geology section, because the dating, right? Because we're talking about dating rocks, both for the age of the dinosaurs, which we'll get to, but then also the age of the formation. They're assuming a consistent decay rate of the daughter particles, and again, we brought this up in a previous video. Nature isn't a laboratory setting, so we shouldn't assume that there aren't any quote contaminant particles, contaminant daughter particles in these stones. Why would you assume that? It's an open-ended process. There's nobody sealing it off and saying, okay, it's not like you have a test tube or a laboratory experiment where you have some material that you hermetically seal off and then you watch the daughter particles decay. You don't do that in nature. In nature, it's all sorts of cross-pollination, cross-mixing. And so how would you tell that you have a single daughter particle like that? And so that was, I think, interesting that they brought up with regards to the geology. And then also the idea of catastrophic processes. That's the other really, big thing they're going for on that. So when you look at, I think it was Kurt Wise they had, where he talked about if we look at current modes of nature, erosion and fossilization and death and everything, we're going to get a certain rate over time. But then the question becomes, should we assume that rate over time is constant? Now, he gives Del Tackett that sort of a Christian theological view that there are epochs of time based on what you might call dispensations of God's actions in the world. But that would still hold true for a non-Christian, because why would you assume necessarily that these processes are at the same rates that they are now as opposed to some other way? I don't see why you would necessarily impose that, even from a non-Christian point of observation.
Yeah, that's why we have used the radiometric dating, because it's intrinsic to the material at hand, right? So basically, if you look at there's let's say we use phosphorus for radiometric dating. There's a certain percentage of that phosphorus. A certain percentage of that phosphorus is in the form of a radioactive isotope, which basically means it has the same physical properties and the same chemical properties of phosphorus, or of any, like as an element, now as an example, but the nucleus has a few too many neutrons, and that makes it a little bit more unstable compared to the other phosphorus nuclei. And so these nuclei, they are a little bit unstable and they decay over time. So then you can say, normally phosphorus would contain 90% of isotope A, that's not radioactive, and 10% of isotope B, that is radioactive. And then you basically look and say, in this case, it only has 5% of isotope B. So half of it must have been vanished. And if you know that the half time of phosphorus decay is, let's say, 1,000 years, then since that rock was sedimented here, that was about 1,000 years. But you don't know. First of all, you don't necessarily know that decay rates are consistent or constant. And second, you don't know whether it has always been that amount of phosphorus that you look at, or whether there has been different amounts of phosphorus in there. So basically, all you can say is this little speck of phosphorus, that's maybe like 1,000 years old, but the entire stone maybe not. So there are inconsistencies, and so that's one thing that is maybe overlooked a little bit.
Yeah. So let me bring up this this really nice chart here, which actually I should probably be able to screen share it, which sort of illustrates an important point here. Okay, so in the history of geology, we have three big categories: catastrophism, uniformitarianism, and actualism. The position that's advocated for in Genesis history is catastrophism. Uniformitarianism is what was proposed by Lyell. Actualism is kind of in between, in a sense, and that's the more modern geological assumption. So what do we have here? How does the Earth change? Catastrophism, big episodic events. Uniformitarianism says continuous uniform events, and then actualism says a range of events. Okay, so, and then consistency of the Earth starts out one way, violent now a different way. Uniformitarianism, same events over time at the same rate Earth is as it has been. Physical laws are constant, but Earth may be different depending on how conditions change. And then rates, fast things long ago, that's catastrophism, uniformitarianism, constant. Actualism, rates vary, but laws don't. Okay, so what's important here is that, the people in the documentary, they say things change, whereas, actualism and uniformitarianism both say the laws don't change. But actualism does allow for some catastrophic events. The problem with this is that the model isn't consistent because, okay, let's look at something we've talked about before. It's not about geology, but it still affects this broader model. Abiogenesis, right? According to biology, the law that Pasteur found and demonstrated is that all life comes from life. It's called biogenesis, and that's just the first law of biology. So abiogenesis has never been observed. If you want to propose it happened, then you have to say that there were different laws in place, because that's not what was discovered by science in the 18th century. And then second of all, we can go back to geology. Let's say the KT extinction event, right? They want to claim that thousands of volcanoes erupted all over the world, creating a nuclear winter, in part because of the impact of the asteroid. Well, okay, that's not continuous uniform events. That's a major catastrophe, an asteroid impact, and all these volcanoes erupting. So really, how is this actually a consistent geological formula for the standard model? Because there's plenty of elements of the standard model that are not continuous uniform events. The asteroid impact is a catastrophic event, and all the volcanoes erupting are catastrophic events. So, how is that? Now, that might be actualism, I suppose. But the thing is, though, I don't think people consistently apply the formula for the standard model of geology. Do you see what I'm saying, Florian?
Yeah, I don't know how geologists actually do it. It would be interesting to know, but yeah, I think that's I think the decay rate of physical material, of radioactive material, that is constant. There's little evidence to say that wouldn't be constant, and that's you can have the stone, you have the material in the lab, and you observe a consistent decay rate, right? That doesn't really change much. But the point was that you bring other elements into the system, so it's not yes, your substance has an intrinsic decay rate, but maybe what you're looking at is not all your substance all the time. That's how I understand it, because I think if you want to have a closed system, radioactive decay is as close to a closed system as you can ever get.
Well, but right. So in nature, you're right. It's an open system, but the other problem besides the fact that they're assuming there's no contamination of daughter particles from outside sources, we don't know what the original value was. How could we?
No, we can basically only say, okay, so there's a certain percentage of radioactive particles in a given material, and and then we look at how much percentage is there now, and then you say, okay, it must have those, like a certain number of percentage must have decayed. But yeah, you're right. We just assume that the original mix between radioactive and non-radioactive isotopes was the same, right? So yeah, that's true. We don't know.
So both of those provide problems for dating the age of rocks. Real quick, I want to answer Middleton
Yeah.
Walker here. I've never even observed the word abiogenesis. Biogenesis means life originating by chemical process from non-life, whereas biogenesis is life coming from life, which is what Pasteur demonstrated in the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, when it comes to the biology part of well, is there anything else you want to say about geology before we move into the biology part?
I think, well, yeah, in general, I mean, geology, if the timescales are so large, right, it's very difficult to really recapitulate that in the lab. I mean, on a small scale, you can look at small samples. You can look at radioactive decay, yes, but all the large scale processes that formed the Earth, that's really very difficult to make a confident statement about. I think because so much change, and then you have a volcanic event. God knows when some volcanoes erupted and when some volcanoes didn't erupt, and we're talking about timescales that are millions of years. So we plus minus several millions of years. That's a huge, that's a huge time scale
Mhm.
on which you have to pretty much rely on faith. You know, you can come up with. So here's the thing: it's always so you always you make these measurements. You have a hypothesis. You observe something. You form a hypothesis. You test this hypothesis, and then you form a model. And usually the smaller processes you observe and the smaller the time scales are, the more your model will resemble your lab test. But if the time scales are so large and the material is in general very unwieldy, and you may not have a good model for that. I mean, you may not have a good model to recapitulate volcano eruptions in the lab. It should be interesting if you manage to do that. But then the model may be very much adrift from your experimental results. So your experimental results may be right, but the model that you have, that may not be all that you can say based on your experiments. And now here's the trouble. You can have a model, and then and that's what you write your paper about. You come up with a model, you show little cartoon pictures, right? And then you go through the TV shows, and they say, "Oh, this researcher found some new evidence," and then they show some models, and then all of a sudden the model becomes public knowledge, right? And everyone assumes that things just work as they're shown in the model. But reality isn't like that, and models are used to make things easier to understand. But even the models of the nucleus, where you have like red protons and white neutrons and little blue electrons swirl around it, it's a model. It doesn't mean you shouldn't expect them, if you ever have the chance to look at an atom, that there's like red and white dots intermixed, right? But that's the model, and everyone believes that's how atom is looking. That's how a nucleus of an atom is looking, and that's the danger with models, right? So in a way, I would say if your scientific results are measuring something that is so unwieldy and so vast on the time scale, yeah, then your models will take on like a lot of faith in in your own
Yeah.
conclusions, right? And faith, I think there's some professionals who know how to deal with faith a little better. Let's say it like this.
Well, the thing is, to your point about models, and this is where most of the creation science critique comes from. It's not criticizing necessarily the method of measurement. It's criticizing the assumptions of the model that are being used, because of course nature is an open system. The geologic ages are proposed to be so vast that
Yeah, exactly. That's the problem. There's where the I fucking love science crowd, these marketing idiocy, has destroyed a lot, because it basically claims that some models that people put up, they are the reality, right? And it's basically a very cartoonish understanding of reality. And if you think about it, you're right. Yeah, they don't criticize the measurements themselves. They don't criticize. They only criticize the conclusions that are made out of that. And sometimes people don't even do the measurements if the conclusions may not agree with their
Yeah.
preformed model, right? And that's
Yeah.
what criticized, not
Well,
the
yeah,
measurement
yeah.
itself. That's a good point. But
So-
modern scientism thinks that models are what's happening in reality, and that's just not true.
Right. Well, that's why, of course, Jack Horner won't C14 data Tyrannosaurus Rex, because his model says he won't find anything. So he already
Yeah.
knows it's not there, right? But the other problem is this goes back to our dinosaur tissue video. If you want to tell me this is what a million years of geologic decay looks like, how would you know? No one's been around a million years to observe that level of geologic decay. Can you quantify it? Can you quantify it and then run it through a computer program to give me some basic understanding of what that might look like? I don't know anybody who's even tried. Do you?
Try to model radioactive decay, or
No. Like the effect of erosion over time on
oh
on sediment. Sediment.
no, I don't. No, I don't.
Because like, how am I supposed to know what a million years of sedimentary decay, erosion looks like? Nobody in the human race, only God could know that, right? Only He's been around long enough to know. And
Yeah.
I don't even know what that would look like. Can we quantify this? Well, according to uniformitarianism, we use active rates. Okay, and then I guess we could plug that into a computer and see what comes out. But yeah, I don't really know. That's not something I've seen anyone do.
Well, it's an extrapolation, right? And the further you extrapolate from, excuse me, the further you extrapolate from your present day measurements, the more imprecise it becomes. If you, I mean, just look at economics when they try to forecast the GDP for next year. That's almost impossible, even though they have like an insane amount of data, right? And if you look at mathematics, it's basically, if you want to have a simple forecast, it's not possible to forecast it more than 1 or 2 periods, right? Especially if the data is as fluctuations and has seasons, like there are seasons where things sell better than other things. There may be seasons when there's erosion stronger than other things, and you have to really jump through a lot of hoops to make a reliable forecast with data that is very noisy. It's almost impossible. You need to have you need to almost study economic math to be able to do these models, and then you just get a little bit of a forecast, but not 2 years is not 2 millions of years, right?
Yeah. Well, to wrap up the geology section, there is an interesting comment. Conby85 said the creationist consensus following the RATE project is that there have been one or more periods of accelerated radioactive decay. So that's that wasn't covered in the documentary, so I can't really weigh in on that right now. But that's one possible thing.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah.
So with the biology, though, now we've already covered the dinosaur soft tissue in detail. I think what I'll just say about it is, yeah, unless it's an artifact or contaminant, they're just not that old. And furthermore, they're not fossils, because by definition, a fossil is something that has no organic material left in it. And in preparation for the video that we did on that topic, I listened to an interview with Mary Schweischer, and she said the same thing. So she's like, yeah, we don't really know what a fossil is anymore. So wait, we don't know what a fossil is, but we're going to still do paleontology with all these baked in assumptions? I mean, this to me is a joke. How is this serious? That would be like saying, Florian, I don't know what a molecule is. Sorry, guys. We're just playing around with this label while we're doing biochemistry, but I don't know what a molecule is. Sorry.
Yeah, did somebody suggest to Schweitzer, if they just measure the C14 content of the dinosaur bone, they may know what a fossil really is? I repeat myself, but yeah. It's like, yeah, we don't really know. I mean, yeah, maybe they do know. They just don't want to measure it, or maybe they have measured it. I mean, you probably like Jack Horner. You know, can you imagine that he maybe just went there and said, uh, let me carbon date this femur just to be on the safe side. Now I'm curious myself. He
Yeah.
didn't like the result and say, I must have made some mistake in measurement here. Let's not talk about that. Let's say,
Yeah.
open up the carpet, put it under, and then she would never talk about it anymore. But Schweitzer has her own lab, right? She has her own, like,
Yes.
I think she has a joint appointment to some natural history museum and the lab, and she's then focusing. I think last I heard she was focusing on extracting proteins from fossils. And yeah, yeah, some remnants of protons may still be there, and you can extract them. I believe that could be there, and even especially if there's still soft tissue there, and so then the whole focus goes away from fossils to can we extract living material. Actually, I think when was it, 2 or 3 years ago, Svante Pääbo got the Nobel Prize in medicine, I think, or physiology, or maybe it was chemistry. No, Svante Pääbo was some of the guys who looked at the DNA of fossils. Actually, look at DNA of mammoths, look at DNA of humans that are preserved in ice over thousands of years, and tries to basically use the DNA to clone like old cells, old organisms, and so the entire focus of the field, I think, has moved a little bit away from determining the age of fossils to determining the if it's possible to create mammoths, right? So these questions are now at the forefront of science, and so I think they just elegantly just sidestep the fossil age issue. They don't talk about it anymore because now the focus is on something else, right?
Yeah.
And I think that also plays a role.
It
Some
does.
questions just remain forever enigmatic because people stop looking at them, and that reason could be that they found something more interesting, or maybe they were glad that they could focus our attention somewhere else, right? And then
Mhm.
better let bygones be bygones and not go there again. But yeah, it's a good
Yeah.
point.
Yeah. Don't disturb the decay rate of the daughter particles.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, if we go back to the biology section, they also bring up an intelligent design argument where they talk about how if we look at the DNA sequence and the way that that sequence dynamically adjusts in all these different in the four dimensions, including the fourth dimension of time. The guy who's just the scientist who's discussing with Del Tackett says, we can't produce computers that can do that. So whoever coded this DNA sequence must be supremely intelligent. And the idea then is again, what what process generates information. And from our information video where we looked at Git's lecture, using information. Now he doesn't quite use Shannon's theory, but it's certainly influenced by it. You have to have a sender.
Well,
Okay, but who's the sender? Well, the sender has to be an intelligence, and given the complexity of the DNA code sequence, it has to be a super intelligence
Well,
God.
yeah, thinking about it, like a lot of our DNA, a lot of the shifts and changes in the DNA are due to viral sequences, like viruses attacking our cells, attacking our DNA, and then just putting their DNA in there. Viruses in total are, I mean, like the vast majority of viruses are not lethal and not even they don't even cause any disease with humans, but they just enter our body, and then they put their DNA into our DNA, and over time, that leads to large. That's the model. So over time, you have like all these virus long stretches, like million base pairs at once, get inserted into the genome, and then some proteins get hit, and then some blocks of proteins get chopped up and get remixed and put back together. And if we think about Shannon's information theory and you think about a blueprint that leads to information being created and not destroyed over time, if that information if there's some kind of information that is transmitted by viral sequences being inserted, that could be one mechanism in which a blueprint is put upon our DNA. That's one possibility in which a blueprint is actually enacted on our DNA, and which is just not some kind of like a random reshuffling of the DNA, but maybe there's some kind of logic to it. And so that just came to my mind right now. That could be one
Yeah.
one way of how information is put into our DNA.
Well, or how it's preserved over time without
Yeah,
loss of fidelity.
true.
Right. But that would still be a mechanism itself that was designed or created by some
Yeah, yeah,
intelligence.
yeah.
That
Of
would,
course.
yeah.
Yeah, but that would be one way in which it could be in which it could happen.
Yeah, and the other element I thought was interesting in the biology section was the stuff that has to do with the missing links. We covered this elsewhere as well. In the Berlinski video, they're just given the now they don't quite come at it from this direction, but given the amount of mechanical changes that would have to occur to turn a cow into a whale, terrestrial four-legged mammal into a whale, you would have to have thousands of transitions, and we don't even have anything close to that. Given the picture, the model picture you're talking about, Florian, we might have at most a dozen, at most. That it's nowhere near enough to fill in the gaps. And furthermore, what Todd Wood was saying in the documentary was that if we look at, say, Neanderthal versus Australopithecus, that Neanderthal looks a lot more like a human, and an Australopithecus looks a lot more like a chimpanzee, and they're not really. He's arguing that the linkage is constructed. It's constructed linkage rather than if you just look at the mechanical, the skeletal structure. They're far more like other things, than this connecting link, which he proposes isn't actually there.
Yeah, well, it could, one you could say, well, maybe genetic changes. You need to accumulate some genetic changes. They stay silent over a while, and if you have once you have a bunch of them together, then you get all of a sudden a different looking humanoid, right? Or chimpanzee or whatever you want to go through that entire sequence. So that could be the reason why you only see like 7 links, not 1,000. But then you would expect the same time that you see like 1,000 fossils of like one stage, and then 1,000 fossils of the next stage. And that also, I don't think that's something they see either. So even then, yeah, it's a little bit difficult to imagine.
Somebody in the comment section, Seamus O'Blaine says Vox Day often talks about the mutation rate issues and uses AI to make his case using numbers calculated by him and backed up by AI. I mean,
oh, why? I need to check his homepage again.
that sounds interesting. But
Yeah.
when it so in one sense, a lot of the quote biological science stuff that they've talked about, we have talked about on our show already, and various separate episodes. But this is kind of a big tie-in here that says, "Oh, okay, guys, this is all together." The other thing is with regards to actually, I feel like I should just bring this up because it's related and it came up after my father watched one of our videos on the dinosaur soft tissue. If the rock sediment was laid down before the animal and then covers the animal, then the animal isn't as old as the rock because the rock by definition predates the sediment predates it. So how does that actually date the animal?
Yeah, that's always the that what I mentioned last time. Also, I think we touched it briefly. Yeah, I mean that's just if the animal is completely engulfed by igneous rock, yeah, then maybe. But yeah, you don't know whether the animal how the animal made it into the sediment, and so that's always like a flaw that you date the surrounding stone, but you don't know whether the animal was there at the stone at the same time, right?
Yes, yes. And so we have two problems now: dating the rock based on assumptions about radioactive decay rate, and then three problems. Then how much radioactive material there was to decay in the first place, the rate of decay, and now the fact that that has nothing to do with the animal that just died, because that animal was because right by definition, if a fossil is an animal that's been rapidly covered by sedimentary material, then it is younger than the sedimentary material that covered it.
Yeah.
So yeah, we have a big problem with, and that's why the soft tissue is such a powerful argument, because now we have something that's tangible, something that's like, oh, hey, you know what? Wow, we actually have something that we can use as a real marker here for the age of these animals. That doesn't help us with rocks, but it does help us with the animals. And so that's important. They didn't get into it as much because it was, I guess, lower on the priority list, was the idea of the size of the universe and stars. Because the idea is like, well, if a star is a million light years away, the assumption is it took a million years for that light to reach us. They don't get into it a whole lot. I've seen other teaching, lectures or documentaries where they go into more detail. But the basic argument is like this: if you were to create, well, when God created Adam and Eve, they looked like fully sexually mature adult male and female, but they're only an instant old, right? But is that the illusion of age? No one's trying to be deceived here. It's just, you make this organism the first time and it just looks like, say, it's, I don't know, 20, right? Because, or if a human being were to create an artificial life form in a lab, it would be fully functional. That's the entire point of creating it. But if it were to develop and grow on its own steam, it might take a lot longer than the instantaneous process of the laboratory experiment. So what they're saying is, if we think about this, how do we know how old this really is if we assume that something was just kind of set in place at the beginning and then the processes develop afterwards?
Yeah. Yeah, I think coming back to what you said about fossils, it probably have more of these fossils in all other dinosaur bones, right? Basically, they should just like crack open some of the bones of dinosaurs and see whether that's a standard thing that there's still preserved tissue in there.
Right, but do you see the point of the argument though? Because if somebody wants to say that starlight is X number of years old because of light years, and it's the quote appearance of age, is it really fair to say it's the appearance of age if you just say, in another example, create a life form in a laboratory? It might be a fully sexually mature biological organism, but it's going to be a second old, right? It's going to look older than it really is. So if we assume creation, that's not really a good framework.
Right. Yeah.
And so again, I think what most people mistake when they look at this creation science stuff is they're not arguing with the measuring process necessarily. Like they use the same measurements, they use the same observations. What they're claiming is that there are assumptions that a scientist has to have before he goes into the laboratory, before he examines geology or flora and fauna, that may or may not be true. And depending on the nature of that assumption, you're going to have wildly different interpretations of the data. And then the question is, okay, so that's one set of it. The second set then is, do we have scientific observations that indicate some of these things are younger than the standard model says? And I think we have a really good example with the soft tissue, where, yeah, it's looking like it's a lot younger than what the standard model says, which then would, if embraced, would then force the standard model to radically alter, which it's not going to do at the present.
Right.
So, yeah. Now, was there anything that maybe you didn't understand from the documentary? Like anything that they were saying that you're like, I don't get what they're saying.
No, that was very clear. Yeah.
All right. Let's see. There's a lot here.
They had the Tower of Babel also in there.
Oh, they did right there at the end. Yeah. So that's more archaeology. So part of this is we have ziggurat pyramid structures all over the world, right? Babylon, Egypt, Mesoamerica, even China. I guess you consider North America if you consider the mound builders, right? And their argument is that all of this is originated from a single attempt at this, which was the Tower of Babel, and then the radiation out. So that knowledge was then carried by these diaspora groups as they go to other parts of the world, right? And so that was the argument that's going on there. And now we're moving into biblical archaeology, and that's, again, only a small part of this video. But a lot of biblical archaeology, from the point of view of those who are proponents of the biblical narrative, is that, if you look at, so for example, while Troy was considered to be totally fictitious by Enlightenment scholars, more rationalists, Babylon was considered to either be fictitious or exaggerated by Enlightenment scholars. And so, using classical and biblical sources, archaeologists eventually found Babylon, the city, even though they said that it probably didn't exist. And there were elements within biblical archaeology in Palestine where this stuff was done as well. And so part of the problem here is that my skeptics on a long enough time frame are always wrong. Troy's real, Babylon's real. For example, if you read the secular, there's a secular Jewish scholar who writes on military history, and he talks on, I can't think of his name at the moment, and he wrote a book on Richard Gabriel, that's his name, and he talks about the warfare in the Bible. So he goes from, like, I think Abraham up until King Solomon. And he says that if you read the geographical descriptions of Palestine, whoever wrote the book, and he's a secular Jew, so he's not saying it's divinely inspired, was an expert cartographer, very accurate, detailed information about geography. The History Channel had a fun Bible battles video, 2-hour special from like the early 2000s, where Gabriel was an expert called in. But what the History Channel used to do is when they cut to a commercial break, there'd be like a "Did you know?" fun fact that would pop up right before the commercial break, and one of them was about a British officer in the First World War who was reading First Samuel as part of his devotion, and it talks about, in the chapter in First Samuel he read, talks about Jonathan and his shield bearer finding a secret pass and outflanking the Philistine positions to attack them from the rear in a surprise move. And he then realized that the battle map he was using, he was right near that area. So he then scouted out where that pass would be. And he said, oh, wow, there it is. So that he then, using the Bible as a guide, navigates the geography of Palestine to win a tactical battlefield victory against the Turks. Now, this is a problem because most scholarship would say that the entire Hebrew Bible was written in Babylon in exile. Well, if you're in exile in Babylon, who has that kind of accurate geographic knowledge? You can't go back. You're in exile. You're locked down in captivity. So the argument, the basic argument that I would have and that others have for biblical archaeology is that on a long enough time frame, it's eventually confirmed to some degree. Now, obviously, firsthand testimony is not the same as an archaeological find, obviously. So what archaeology does prove is not maximal, but it does prove the plausibility of a lot of these cases.
Yeah, I mean, it's always, it's always surprising that, when you say that Troy was found by, or Babylon was found by accounts from the Bible and from geography, then there was some truth to it, right? And I find that pretty amazing. I mean, how much is there, right? How much is true about the geographic records in the Bible? But there have been yeah, it's also true that there have been a lot of changes over time by cross pollination with other ideas and other writings. So, but I'm actually pretty impressed that they were able to find Babylon with help of the Bible.
Yeah, no, that's they also use classical sources like Herodotus and others, but comparing all these different elements, they were able to triangulate the position of
Yeah,
of
and
Babylon.
also nobody thought it was. Yeah, Enlightenment scholars said, yeah, it's a myth, it's not real, and then they found it. I never really realized what it really meant when they found Troy, but it was a huge upset for the models that people had, right? So
Yes.
coming back to the dinosaurs, it's not impossible that preformed paradigms may become wrong again.
Yeah, the other important element was they talk about the Cambrian explosion. So the idea
Yeah.
is if you have a kind of gradualistic, which is what Dawkins' position was. He even said publicly at one point, Darwinian theory is gradual without gradualization. It's not Darwinism. I guess he should have told Stephen Jay Gould that, but whatever. There's such a jump that the problem with the Cambrian explosion is in the fossil record, there's not enough time necessary to go from the simple single-celled organisms to all the different phyla that's seen according to the standard model about 500 million years ago. And it's like, okay, well, that's the broader problem of gradualism. But yeah, you go from really not seeing much of anything to all of these different biological systems that just seem to pop out of nowhere.
So the argument is basically that mutations accumulate without having any effect, and then all of a sudden, after reaching critical mass, you have this explosion in diversity, which was like you go from a little bit diversity to a lot of diversity in a short amount of time. That was the point, right? That genes can change without having a clear expression in the phenotype, and then when you have reached a critical mass on mutations, all of a sudden, boom, you get the Cambrian explosion. Is that the point? Is that what Dawkins said?
Well, so I don't exactly know how Dawkins would respond to that. One of the reasons why, and I haven't really studied it much, but Punctuated Equilibria, which is put out by Stephen Jay Gould, was in part a response to these short time frames. Like there isn't enough time in the geologic record for this gradual process to happen. So you've got basically three options to work with here. You've got the option of is Genesis history, which says, well, there just aren't long ages of time here. You're misreading the fossil record. You've got the classic Darwinian perspective, which struggles to account for the sudden appearance of all this life. And then you have the modified Darwinian perspective of punctuated equilibria, which I don't know all the details, but it basically says you have these like momentous events where you have lots of biological change compressed in a short amount of time, and then it kind of goes back to stasis. I'm not sure what mechanism they propose. I haven't really studied that, but those are your three options. And what this documentary was saying was the most reasonable option is that there just isn't that much time between these single-celled organisms we find on the record and then the organisms we find in the Cambrian explosion.
Yeah. Well, it sounds a little bit like we use some unknown. We use some, we want to stick with our model, and so we bend ourselves a little bit to explain it with something that doesn't sound quite logical, but it still serves to keep our model alive. But I haven't looked enough into the punctuated equilibrium to talk more about that.
Yeah, well, we got something from Seamus O'Blain here. Michael Levin's agentive intelligence might play into evolution where the genome plus the biology plus the organs plus the cells are all deliberately exploring state spaces which might cumulatively drive change quicker. Okay, so it sounds like he's saying that one explanation from the Darwinian crowd, so you have like this like sweet spot where all the mechanisms align to sort of jumpstart a process. I'm not
Yeah.
sure. I'm not sure what they're describing or how that would happen, but yeah, I could see that might be how a punctuated equilibria would say that. But I don't know. I think that actually punctuated equilibria is a little bit even harder to sustain than gradualism because we have already covered the problem of irreducible complexity, which I think is very serious for gradualism. But you'd have to then come up with a mechanism which could create a lot of biological change very quickly. And we don't see that. And furthermore, because remember, the argument is we look at natural occurring processes that are slow and we extrapolate them into the past. Darwin gets this from the Geology of Charles Lyell. So the gradualist narrative at least kind of conforms to that principle. Punctuated equilibria doesn't at all. It proposes an unknown mechanism that we don't see. We don't see in nature these stars aligning, so to speak, that would allow rapid speciation.
Well, the only thing I can say about that is that many mutations are just simply tolerated. They are not making the animal better. They're not making the animal per se worse off. They're just there and they're kind of tolerated. There's also some species that have a genome duplication event, right? So they went from in the evolutionary history, they went like earlier forms have a diploid genome, right? Like we have that every gene has two copies, and then like for example zebrafish and other teleostic fish, they have four. Basically, they're not diploid but tetraploid. They, which means the DNA is still, so I should correct myself. They're still diploid, but their genes are basically, several of them are not duplicated but quadrupled, right? So at one point there was another genome duplication, or like an additional copy, additional duplication of genes, and so that makes those animals like fish, for that reason, may actually tolerate many mutations, because if one gene is mutated and doesn't work anymore, you still have three copies, right? Instead of like one intact copy. So it takes a lot of time to manifest a mutation in such an organism, right? Because you need to go through four copies, and so then you could have several mutations that are subtle, just subcritical. They just accumulate, and then at one point, boom, everything goes bust. That's one thing how I could spontaneously explain punctuated equilibrium, but as I said, I haven't looked deeply enough into that, so I can't say much more about that than
No,
that.
yeah, that's fine. I think we've covered most of the big sequences of this documentary.
Yeah.
Could you give us a summary of your thought on the documentary, the arguments made, the broader model assumed, and just kind of give us your final thought on it?
Yeah, so one thing, the documentary is done very well. I recommend everyone to watch it. The music is nice, the coloring is nice, the how do you call it? The screen view is very nice, and basically right there, it's not, some scientists try to display display creationists as lame, some lame hobos that are really some rednecks that are too stupid to understand science, or they can't really get anything. No, I mean, that movie is very nicely done, right? And the points that the movie make, you can't really um, move them so easily aside. Several of them, right? If you don't believe in creationism, those arguments they make, you should still listen to. And in general, I would say that so many things that we take for granted are just not so, and can change in an instant. Like when you reminded us of Troy and Babylon again, it was like one of the time points where I said, like, yes, of course, paradigms can change in an instant, you know, and so nothing that is said is is as it happens. Nothing what the I fucking love science crowd says is really written in stone, right? These paradigms can change really quickly, and that we should always keep that in mind. Just because someone has a convincing model, and just because 97% of scientists have a consensus that this and that thing is happening, doesn't mean that it's really so, right? I think that's what this documentary also shown, what you really need to keep in mind. The model that you're told is not set in stone.
Yeah, exactly. And what I'll just reiterate as my closing thought is that the argument that of the broader creationist critique, right, is not that the methods of science that we use are false. They're not saying that. What they're saying is there's assumptions about how they're used. So again, in nature, you have to make assumptions that you can't measure. You have to make the assumption first and then measure what you do see and then fit that into your assumption. One is, what is that assumption? Two, is that assumption warranted? Three, are there observable scientific realities that indicate youth rather than age? And yeah, it's more of a meta critique, right? It's like critiquing the model. It's critiquing the way you think about the model, the way you think about the science, rather than criticizing, oh, we're going to go out and do some field work and make measurements and collect samples and so on.
Yeah.
And so, and most people who are not creationists or are not familiar do not view it that way, but that's part of the blackout of the media trying to intentionally paint them in a bad light. So that's what this documentary does a very good job of summarizing and showing that this is actually what's really at stake here. So yeah. So thanks again, Florian. It's great having you on.
All right. Thanks for having me.
This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast signing off.